We journey back in time, not just to visit a forgotten world, but to solve one of history's greatest and most haunting mysteries. I want you to picture something in your mind. Imagine a civilization so advanced, so powerful, that it built a world of cities that gleamed under the sun, from the misty shores of Britain to the golden sands of the Sahara. Imagine cities with populations of over 1 million people, living in towering apartment buildings with running water. Imagine palaces of marble and granite, colossal stadiums that could hold 50,000 cheering fans, and public baths as large as 10 football fields, with heated floors and pools of steaming water. Imagine a network of stone highways so masterfully engineered that some are still in use today, connecting hundreds of these magnificent cities in a web of commerce and culture. Merchants from Africa, India, and China traded silks, spices, and precious gems in bustling city squares. This was the urban world of the Roman Empire. Imagine walking to the heart of that same civilization just a few centuries later. The million-person metropolis has withered to a town of 30,000 souls wandering through crumbling ruins. Wild boars root through the abandoned marble forums. The grand aqueducts that once carried rivers of fresh water from the mountains are cracked and dry. The world's greatest roads are overgrown with weeds, becoming dangerous tracks for bandits and beggars. This is the story of Rome and countless other cities just like it. How did the most sophisticated urban civilization the world had ever seen simply vanish? It's a question that has puzzled historians for centuries, a ghost story on a civilization-wide scale. And the answer is far more complex, more fascinating, and frankly, more relevant to our own world than you could ever imagine. Before we step onto these ghostly streets and begin to piece together the clues, if you're the kind of person who loves to unravel the great mystery, who feels a thrill when you look at ancient ruins and wonder about the lives lived within them, then you're in the right place. Help our community of history explorers grow by tapping that subscribe button and giving this video a like. It tells the great algorithm of the internet that there are still people who care about these incredible stories. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you joining me from tonight? Are you in a cozy apartment in London, a dorm room in Texas, or maybe listening on your commute in Sydney? Drop a comment below. I read every single one and love knowing where our fellow history lovers are. Now, settle in. Let's dim the lights and travel back together to a world of unbelievable achievement and uncover why it all disappeared. The urban miracle. To truly understand what was lost, we need to forget the romantic, broken columns you see on postcards. We need to see a Roman city as it truly was, a living, breathing, roaring machine of civilization. Let's step back in time, not to the famous heart of Rome itself, but to a city in what is now Western Germany, a place the Romans called Trier. In its heyday, it was known as the Rome of the North, and it would have absolutely blown your mind. Imagine you're a merchant arriving at Trier's gates in the year 150 AD. The first thing that hits you is the sheer, overwhelming scale of it all. The city is encircled by 4 miles of massive limestone walls, 30 feet high, punctuated by towering defensive gates that look more like triumphal arches. These weren't just walls. They were a statement of power, of permanence. As you pass through the northern gate, a colossal structure that still stands today, known as the Port of Niagara, the sound of the city washes over you. It's a glorious symphony of chaos, the rhythmic hammering from blacksmith shops, the rumble of iron-rimmed wagon wheels on perfectly paved stone streets, the shouts of vendors hawking everything from British wool to Egyptian glass, and the murmur of a dozen languages, Latin, Greek, Celtic, Germanic dialects. Then come the smells. The aroma of freshly baked bread from countless bakeries, the sharp tang of leather from tanners' workshops, the exotic scent of spices drifting from the market, the occasional whiff from the underground sewers. Because even the Romans weren't perfect. Trier at its peak was home to around 80,000 people. That might not sound like much today. Paris wouldn't reach that population again for nearly 1,000 years. And unlike the sprawling, chaotic cities of the medieval period, Trier was a masterpiece of urban planning. Its main streets were laid out in a perfect grid, wide enough for 2 large wagons to pass each other with ease. Along these avenues stood magnificent 3-story buildings with shops on the ground floor, apartment above, and vibrant frescoes painted on their exteriors, telling stories of gods and heroes. But here's where Roman engineering becomes truly breathtaking. Every major building in Trier was connected to not one, but 2 separate water systems. The first was a marvel of engineering, a massive aqueduct that carried fresh, clean drinking water from springs 30 miles away in the mountains. Roman engineers had calculated the precise gradient needed, a gentle slope of just 2 feet per mile. to keep the water flowing steadily day and night. The second system was an intricate network of underground sewer pipes that carried wastewater away from homes, baths, and workshops, keeping the city remarkably clean and hygienic for the ancient world. And the amenities, let's talk about the imperial baths. Picture a complex covering 15 acres, larger than 10 modern football fields. This wasn't just a place to get clean. It was the city's social heart, a combination of a community center, a gym, a spa, and a business lounge. You could sweat in a hot room heated to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit by an ingenious underfloor heating system called a hypocaust. You could swim in a swimming pool-sized cold plunge, get a massage with imported olive oil, read scrolls in a library, negotiate a business deal, or simply gossip with your friends. This level of public luxury wouldn't be seen again in Europe until the 19th century. Every Roman city had its entertainment, and Trier was no exception. Carved cleverly into a hillside, could seat 20,000 spectators, one in every 4 residents. Here, you could watch gladiators battle, exotic animals from Africa fight, or even witness mock naval battles, for which the arena floor could be flooded and then drained in less than an hour. But what truly defined a city like Trier was its cosmopolitan spirit. Tombstones and inscriptions tell us of people from Syria, Africa, Spain, and Britain all living and working side by side. A Syrian merchant might be neighbors with a retired British soldier. A Germanic craftsman's daughter might marry the son of a wine trader from Gaul. This was a melting pot of cultures, a truly global community held together by the shared identity of being Roman. This was the urban miracle the Romans built, not just in Trier, but in hundreds of cities across their empire. They were engines of prosperity, centers of innovation, and symbols of a civilization that believed it would last forever. How does a world so confident, so powerful, so brilliantly engineered just fade away? The answer is a single event, but a cascade of failures, a perfect storm of crises that began with the very engine that powered it all, the economic engine that conquered the world. Behind all the marble in the aqueducts was an economic machine so sophisticated, so ruthlessly efficient, that it made these urban miracles possible. Understanding this engine is the first key to solving our mystery. To do that, let's imagine the life of a fictional Roman entrepreneur we'll call Marcus, living in the year 180 AD. Marcus lives in Aquileia, a bustling port city in northern Italy. A letter arrives via the cursus publicus, the Roman imperial postal service, a system of relay stations that could move a message across the empire faster than anything Europe would see again until the invention of the railroad. The letter is from a business associate in Alexandria. It informs Marcus of a critical shortage of high-quality British wool. Here's where the Roman economic genius kicks in. For Marcus, this isn't a logistical nightmare. It's a golden opportunity. He doesn't think locally, he thinks globally on an imperial scale. He uses his network of contacts to set in motion an incredibly complex supply chain. He sends a letter of credit, a kind of ancient bank transfer, to his agent in Londinium to purchase tons of raw wool directly from British farmers. The wool is transported on stone-paved Roman roads to the coast, loaded onto a Roman merchant ship, and sailed across the English Channel. It's then transferred to river barges and carried down the rivers of Gaul to the Mediterranean, where it's loaded onto a larger seagoing vessel for final journey to Alexandria. The entire 4,000-mile journey is insured by a company on the island of Rhodes that specializes in maritime law. Here's the mind-blowing part. Marcus can manage this entire transaction using a single accepted everywhere from Scotland to Sudan. He operates under a single, unified legal framework that protects his contracts and property rights. He uses standardized weights and measures, ensuring he gets exactly what he paid for. Imagine trying to do that today across a dozen different countries with different currencies, laws, and regulations. The Romans had created history's first true single market. The sheer volume of this trade, archaeologists estimate that the Roman Empire was moving around 50 million tons of goods annually. That's more than the entire continent of Europe would trade during the height of the Middle Ages, 1,000 years later. The foundation of this system was the legendary Roman road network. Over 50,000 miles of major paved highways and 200,000 miles of secondary roads connected every corner of the empire. These weren't just dirt tracks. They were engineering marvels, built in layers with sophisticated drainage systems, mile markers, and roadside inns. A merchant could travel from Rome to Germany in about 40 days, a journey that would take over 3 months in medieval times. Speed meant profit. But it was the financial system that was the real secret weapon. The Romans had developed everything from international banking and letters of credit to joint stock companies, business partnerships that could pool vast amounts of capital and outlast their founders. A merchant in Spain could deposit a fortune with a banker and withdraw the equivalent amount in Syria without a single coin ever making the dangerous journey. This economic interconnectedness created incredible specialization. Spain produced nearly all the empire's silver and olive oil. Egypt was a breadbasket, producing enough grain to feed millions in the cities. Gaul produced fine wine and pottery, while Germany supplied amber and slaves. Each region did what it did best, and the roads and sea lanes tied them all together in a single, hyper-efficient economic web. This wealth, generated by trade and specialization, is what paid for the aqueducts, the amphitheaters, and the armies that defended it all. But this incredible system, this miracle of ancient globalization, was built on a set of fragile foundations. It depended on three things: absolute political stability, the Pax Romana or Roman peace, unquestioned military security to keep the roads and sea lanes safe, and a constantly growing population to provide labor and create new markets. For over 2 centuries, this system seemed invincible. It created a level of prosperity for ordinary citizens in cities that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. But as our fictional merchant Marcus was calculating his profits, forces were gathering on the frontiers and deep within the empire's own government that would shatter those 3 foundations. The machine was about to break down. A world on the move. Popular history loves a simple story. Savage barbarian hordes sweep down from the north, burn everything in sight, and the Roman Empire falls. As uncovered by modern archaeology and more careful reading of history, is far more complex and far more tragic. The real story isn't one of invasion, but of a massive, desperate migration, a refugee crisis on an unprecedented scale. The year is 376 AD. The Roman guard stationed on the Danube River frontier witness a sight that chills them to the bone. Stretching to the horizon is not an army, but an entire nation on the move. 200,000 Visigoths, men, women, and children, with their wagons and their livestock, are crowded on the far bank, begging to be allowed into the safety of the Roman Empire. These were not strangers. The Goths had been Rome's neighbors for generations. Many had served in the Roman army. Their leaders spoke Latin and understood Roman politics. They weren't coming to conquer. They were running for their lives. What could possibly terrify an entire nation of hardened warriors so much that they would abandon their ancestral lands? The answer was a name that would become a synonym for terror. The Huns were a nomadic people who had swept out of the steppes of Central Asia with terrifying speed and military prowess. They were a force of nature, a human earthquake that was displacing every tribe in their path. As the Huns pushed westward, they set off a chain reaction, a domino effect of displacement that sent dozens of panicked tribes, like the Goths, crashing against Rome's borders. The Roman government, weakened by internal corruption and political instability, handled the crisis disastrously. They allowed the Goths to enter the empire, but then exploited and starved them. Corrupt Roman officials sold them dog meat at exorbitant prices and stole their children to sell as slaves. The desperate and betrayed Goths rebelled. This led to the famous Battle of Adrianople, where a Roman emperor was killed and his army annihilated. But even this was not the fall of the empire. What followed was far more insidious. Take the infamous sack of Rome in 410 AD by the Visigoth king Alaric. Wasn't some wild barbarian. He was a former Roman general who felt he and his people had been betrayed by the Roman government. He had marched on Rome not to destroy it, but to negotiate a better deal for his people, land to settle and back pay he was owed. He tried to negotiate peacefully 3 times. It was only after months of being double-crossed by the emperor that he finally allowed his troops into the city. And even then, the sack was remarkably restrained. They looted treasure, but largely spared the civilian population and the city's Christian churches. The real damage to Rome's cities wasn't coming from these dramatic sieges. It was happening quietly, invisibly, in the countryside. As various Germanic groups, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, moved into the empire, they didn't always conquer cities. They settled in the rural areas. They took over the great agricultural estates, becoming the new landlords. Life might not have changed much. You just paid your taxes and rent to a new Germanic lord instead of a Roman one. This was a death sentence. Roman cities didn't grow their own food. They were completely dependent on the surplus grain, wine, and olive oil produced by the surrounding countryside. They were also dependent on the taxes collected from these rural areas to pay for everything: aqueduct repairs, public officials, the police force. When Germanic lords took over the countryside, they disrupted this flow and the wealth of themselves and their followers. They stopped paying taxes to the central Roman government. Slowly but surely, the economic lifelines that fed the cities were being cut. The urban markets began to shrink. There was less food available. The city governments ran out of money to pay for public services. The great urban machine was slowly starving. While the frontiers were in turmoil, an even more devastating crisis was unfolding from within, right in the palm of every Roman's hand. It was a crisis of money. Because when a civilization's money becomes worthless, everything it is built upon, trust, trade, stability. Imagine you are a Roman soldier in the year 200 AD. You are paid in a silver coin called a denarius. It's heavy, shiny, and made of about 85% pure silver. You can use it to buy goods anywhere in the empire, and everyone accepts it as real, intrinsic value. Fast forward to the year 270 AD. You're still paid in a coin called a denarius, but something has changed. That's because it contains barely 5% silver. The rest is just cheap metal like bronze and tin. In just 2 generations, the government has essentially destroyed its own currency. It began with what economists call a death spiral. The empire was facing constant military pressure on its borders, which was incredibly expensive. To pay for the armies, emperors needed more money. But raising taxes on an already struggling population was politically dangerous and economically destructive. So they resorted to a seemingly easy solution. They would recall old silver coins, melt them down, mix the silver with cheaper metals, and mint a greater number of new coins. At first, it seemed like magic, but people aren't stupid. They quickly realized the new coins were junk. This led to a catastrophic chain of events. First came runaway inflation. As more and more worthless coins flooded the market, prices for everything exploded. A loaf of bread that cost half a denarius in 260 AD cost 200 denarii by 300 AD. This is hyperinflation, and it wipes out the savings of ordinary people. Imagine watching your entire life savings, carefully stored in a jar, become worthless in just a few years. Archaeologists find these pathetic hordes of debased coins buried all over the empire, the last desperate act of families who watched their future evaporate. Next, trade collapsed. Why would a merchant from Egypt sell his precious grain for a handful of worthless coins? Long-distance trade, the lifeblood of Roman cities, became incredibly difficult. Markets reverted to primitive barter systems. The complex, interconnected economy that had made Roman cities so prosperous simply seized up. Trust in the government evaporated. Money is more than just metal. It's a promise from the government that the currency is stable and valuable. By systematically deceiving its own people, the Roman government destroyed that trust. This internal rot was arguably more destructive than any barbarian army. It destroyed the middle class, hollowed out the economy, and made urban life, which depended entirely on a functioning monetary system, almost impossible to sustain. The grand cities, with their markets and shops, began to empty out, not because they were attacked, but because the very concept of money that held them together had died. A revolution of the soul. As the physical and economic world of the Roman cities was crumbling, an even more profound revolution was taking place in the minds and hearts of the people. It was a psychological and spiritual shift so total that an entire civilization began to question the very value of city life itself. This was the rise of Christianity, but its impact went far beyond just religion. For 1,000 years, to be Roman was to be urban. Civilization was found in the bustling forum, the grand theater. The countryside was for peasants and barbarians. Status, success, and meaning were all found in the vibrant, competitive, material world of the city. Picture yourself as a wealthy, educated Roman in the year 390 AD. Your city is facing economic collapse, political instability, and the constant threat of raids. The old gods and traditions seem to offer no comfort. And then you hear stories of a new kind of hero, not a general or an emperor, a holy man who has abandoned the city, given away all his wealth, and gone to live a simple life of prayer in a remote cave in the desert. And people are saying this man has found true peace, a direct connection to God. This was the birth of monasticism, and it represented a radical rejection of everything Roman urban culture stood for. The most admired people in society were no longer the wealthy senators who built public fountains, but the ascetics who chose poverty. The new heroes were the monks who chose community and cooperation over the city's relentless competition. Wealthy and talented Romans began to abandon urban life in droves. They gave away their fortunes, sold their city villas, and founded monasteries in rural areas. These were not primitive communes. They were highly organized, self-sufficient communities that were becoming alternative, more successful versions of cities. A monastery had workshops that produced food, clothing, and tools, where monks painstakingly copied and preserved the great works of classical literature and science, books that would have been lost in the chaos of the collapsing cities. It had a school for children and a hospital for the sick. It offered something the decaying Roman cities could no longer provide: security, purpose, and a strong sense of community. This shift completely changed the urban landscape. For centuries, wealthy Romans had competed to fund public buildings like theaters and amphitheaters to gain social status. Wealthy Christians believed that true honor came from serving the poor. Instead of funding gladiatorial games, they funded the first hospitals, orphanages, and shelters for the homeless. The focus of society was shifting from public spectacle to private charity, from the forum to the church. This was a cognitive revolution. People were literally rewiring their brains to value different things. The pursuit of wealth and worldly success, the very engine of Roman urbanism, came to be seen by many as a spiritual trap. The good life was no longer found in a marble villa in the city, prayerful existence dedicated to God. As this new worldview took hold, the grand cities of the Roman world began to seem not just unsustainable, but spiritually bankrupt. People didn't just flee the dying cities. Choosing a new path they believed led to salvation. The unraveling of the world, the crises we discussed, migration, economic collapse, spiritual change, were all devastating. But they were made infinitely worse by a more mundane but equally catastrophic failure: the collapse of infrastructure. The Roman world was literally held together by its roads and aqueducts. When those arteries clogged and broke, the body of civilization began to die. Imagine the Via Appia, the great highway leading south from Rome, in the year 200 AD. Heavy wagons groan under the weight of trade goods. Imperial messengers gallop between relay stations. Legions march in perfect formation, and merchants travel in comfortable carriages. The road is a marvel, perfectly paved, drained, and maintained. Picture that same road in 450 AD. The paving stones are cracked and missing, overgrown with weeds. A key bridge has collapsed, forcing travelers to make a dangerous river crossing. The inns and way stations are crumbling ruins, havens for bandits. What was once a superhighway is now a treacherous dirt track. Roman roads required constant, expensive, and highly organized maintenance. There were dedicated officials, teams of engineers, and legions of workers responsible for keeping them clear and in good repair. This entire system was funded by imperial taxes. But as the tax system collapsed and the empire fragmented, the maintenance simply stopped. The consequences were catastrophic. The roads were the circulatory system of the empire. When they became unreliable, long-distance trade withered. A city like Lyon in France had thrived as a transportation hub. When the roads leading to it fell into disrepair, merchants simply stopped coming. Its famous pottery workshops, which had exported their wares across the empire, shut down. The city, which had once been a vibrant center of commerce, it died of isolation. The same story played out with the aqueducts. These incredible structures were the life support systems for large urban populations. The 11 aqueducts that fed Rome brought in 300 million gallons of fresh water every single day. Maintaining them was a monumental task. They were not repaired. Without a reliable water supply, the great public baths, the very heart of Roman social life, had to shut down. Sanitation systems failed, making cities less healthy. The population could no longer be supported. People began to abandon the once great urban centers, not because of an invading army, but because they could no longer get a clean drink of water. The unraveling of this physical infrastructure was a final, fatal blow for many cities. They had become too complex, too sophisticated, too dependent on systems that no one had the money or organization to maintain anymore. The scourge of God, the final blow. Just when it seemed things couldn't possibly get worse, the Roman world was visited by a new kind of horror, an invisible enemy that was more deadly than any army and more terrifying than any economic collapse. In the year 541 AD, a devastating pandemic, known as the Plague of Justinian, swept across the Mediterranean. Modern science has identified it as the same bacterium that causes bubonic plague. The plague arrived in Constantinople, the capital of the surviving Eastern Roman Empire, aboard grain ships from Egypt, carried by fleas on rats that infested the ship's holds. The very trade networks that had once been the source of prosperity now became conduits of death. The historian Procopius, who witnessed the plague firsthand, described a city that became a living nightmare. 10,000 people were dying every single day. There was no one to bury the dead. Bodies were left in the streets or stacked in piles in abandoned buildings. The entire social fabric of the city, the markets closed. The government ceased to function. The city that had been the jewel of the world fell silent, gripped by terror and grief. Modern estimates suggest the plague killed between 25 and 40% of the population in the regions it touched. This was a demographic catastrophe on a scale that is difficult for us to comprehend, but its most profound impact was psychological. Cities have been seen as places of relative safety. They had walls for defense and granaries to store food against famine. The plague turned that logic on its head. The dense populations of cities made them death traps. The disease spread like wildfire through crowded apartment buildings and markets, while people living in isolated rural villages were often spared. The plague did not strike. It returned in devastating waves every decade or so for the next 2 centuries. Each wave further depleted the urban population, making any kind of recovery impossible. Why would anyone choose to move to a city when it was clear that doing so was a death sentence? The Great Migration from the countryside to the city, which had fueled Roman urban growth for centuries, fled the cities for the relative safety of the countryside. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the very idea of the city as a desirable place to live. Horrifying chapter in the long, slow death of the Roman urban world. Life after the city, a new world rises. As the great cities of Rome hollowed out and faded, a completely new way of life and a new system of power was emerging in the countryside. It wasn't planned or designed. It was an improvised solution to a world in chaos. We call it feudalism. With the central Roman government gone, there was no one to provide security. The roads were infested with bandits, and rival warlords were constantly on the move. In this dangerous new world, your survival depended on protection. People made a practical choice. They gave their loyalty to the most powerful local figure, a Germanic warlord or a former Roman aristocrat who had fortified his country villa in exchange for safety. This was the feudal bargain. A lord would grant a piece of land to a follower. In return, the vassal swore an oath of absolute loyalty and promised to fight for the lord when called upon. This created a pyramid of personal loyalties, from the king at the top down to the local knight. What's crucial to understand is that this system was entirely rural. Power and wealth were no longer based in cities, but in the ownership of land. A lord's castle or fortified manor house became the new center of political, economic, and social life. These estates aimed to be completely self-sufficient. They grew their own food, raised their own livestock, made their own clothes, and forged their own tools and weapons. This new reality made cities economically irrelevant. Why would a feudal lord travel to a dangerous, decaying city to buy goods when he could produce everything he needed on his own estate? Long-distance trade dried up even further. The vibrant, interconnected world of the Roman Empire was replaced by a fragmented landscape of isolated, self-sufficient rural communities. The great Roman cities didn't just shrink. For a time, they lost their very reason for being. The focus of European civilization had shifted from the paved forum. This process was accelerated by one final, massive geopolitical shift. The rise of Islam in the 7th century and its rapid conquest in North Africa and the Middle East didn't just create a new empire, it completely rewired the trade routes of the ancient world. For centuries, the Mediterranean Sea had been a Roman lake, a superhighway connecting all the provinces of the empire. Now it became a frontier, a dividing line between two rival civilizations, Christendom and the Islamic Caliphate. The Islamic world experienced its own urban golden age. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba became the world's new centers of wealth, science, and culture. The old trade routes that had funneled Asian spices and Egyptian grain to Europe were redirected to feed these magnificent new cities. For the struggling, isolated towns of Western Europe, this was the final cut. They were now on the periphery of the world, cut off from the main arteries of global commerce. The Roman urban experiment, it seemed, was well and truly over. The survivors and the seeds of rebirth. Amidst the ruins and the silence, the idea of the city, a few remarkable places managed to survive, not by clinging to the old Roman model, but by adapting, innovating, and reinventing themselves for a new era. These survivor cities held the flickering flame of urban life through the darkest centuries, and their stories are lessons in resilience. By the 6th century, the former capital of the world, its population had collapsed by over 90%. But Rome had a new asset. It was the home of the Pope, the head of the Christian Church in the West. The city cleverly transformed itself. It was no longer the center of a political empire, but the center of a spiritual one. It stopped trying to feed a million citizens and instead built a new economy based on religious tourism or pilgrimage. Christians from all over Europe braved the dangerous roads to visit the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul. They brought money, they needed places to stay, and they bought souvenirs. Rome survived by finding a new purpose. Then there was Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine. Empire was besieged by enemies on all sides and repeatedly ravaged by the plague, yet endured for another 1,000 years. By becoming a fortress of knowledge and a workshop for luxury, its scholars preserved the great works of Greek science and philosophy. Its craftsmen produced goods of such exquisite quality, like silk textiles woven with gold thread, that they were in high demand even among their enemies. Constantinople survived by being smarter and more skilled than anyone else. And in a few places, like Venice, something entirely new began to emerge. Built by refugees fleeing invaders on a collection of muddy islands in a lagoon, Venice had no land, no resources. It should have been a footnote in history. It became one of the richest and most powerful cities in the world. The Venetians did it by mastering the sea and inventing a new, more aggressive form of capitalism. They built vast trading fleets and created sophisticated business techniques, like joint stock companies and maritime insurance, that allowed them to dominate Mediterranean trade. These survivor cities, Rome, Constantinople, Venice, and others like them became the laboratories where a new kind of urban life was being forged. They were smaller, more focused, and more adaptable than their Roman predecessors. They were learning to live in a networked world rather than an imperial one. They were planting the seeds of an urban renaissance that, when it finally bloomed, would change the world forever. Around the year 1000, after centuries of slumber, something incredible began to happen. Like a dormant forest after a fire, cities began to spring back to life all across Europe. This wasn't a restoration of the old Roman world, something new, dynamic, and powerful. The revival was fueled by several factors. A period of warmer climate led to better harvests and a growing population. New agricultural technologies, like the heavy plow and the horse collar, created food surpluses for the first time in centuries. This freed people from a life of subsistence farming and allowed them to become craftsmen, merchants, and scholars. And where did these people go? They flocked to the old towns and founded new ones, seeking opportunity and freedom. But these new medieval cities were fundamentally different from their Roman ancestors. Roman cities have been top-down creations, centers of imperial administration. Medieval cities grew from the bottom up. They were founded by merchants and craftsmen who banded together for mutual protection and profit. They fought for and won charters of liberty from feudal lords and kings, creating self-governing islands of freedom in a sea of feudalism. A German proverb from the time said it all: "City air makes you free." These cities became engines of innovation. In the workshops of Florence, bankers invented double-entry bookkeeping and international letters of credit, laying the foundations of modern finance. In the textile towns of Flanders, craftsmen developed new weaving techniques and production systems that created cloth of unparalleled quality, which they exported across the continent. In the port cities of Germany, merchants formed the Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of trading cities that monopolized trade in the Baltic and North Seas. These cities were competitive, but they were also connected. They formed vast trading networks, linking the wool of England with the looms of Flanders, the timber of the Baltic with the shipyards of Italy, and the spices of the East with the markets of the West. They were not part of a single empire, but a decentralized network of independent, dynamic hubs. The wealth they generated fueled an explosion of culture and learning, the construction of the great Gothic cathedrals, the founding of the first universities, and the artistic glories of the Renaissance. The city was once again the center of European civilization, but this time it was a civilization built not on the command of emperors, but on the ambition, ingenuity, and cooperation of free citizens. Echoes in our world, the lessons of the fall. So here we are at the end of our long journey. We have walked the gleaming streets of imperial Trier and the ghostly ruins of abandoned Rome. We have seen a world of cities rise, collapse, and be reborn. It's a fascinating story from the distant past. But what does it mean for us, living in our own world of sprawling, complex, and sometimes fragile cities? The echoes of this ancient story are all around us, and they offer profound and sometimes unsettling lessons. The first lesson is that interconnectedness is both a great strength and a terrifying vulnerability. The Roman economy's incredible efficiency came from its globalized network, but that same network allowed economic shocks and deadly diseases to spread across the entire civilization with frightening speed. Today, our own globalized world is even more hyperconnected. We've seen how a supply chain disruption on one side of the planet can lead to empty shelves on the other, and how a virus can circle the globe in a matter of weeks. The Roman story is a stark reminder that resilience requires more than just efficiency. The second lesson is that civilization is a high-maintenance enterprise. The Romans built for eternity, but their creations required constant, organized, and expensive upkeep. When the political will and the economic resources to maintain their infrastructure vanished, their world literally fell apart. Today, we face our own infrastructure crisis. In many cities, roads, bridges, and water systems built in a more prosperous era are crumbling. The Roman experience shows us that neglecting the foundations of our society, assuming they will last forever without investment, is a path to decay. The third, and perhaps most important, lesson is about adaptation. The cities that survived the collapse were not the biggest or the strongest, but the ones that were able to reinvent themselves. Rome transitioned from a political to a spiritual capital. Constantinople shifted to a knowledge-based economy. Venice pioneered a new model of commercial enterprise. They survived because they were willing to let go of a past that was no longer working and embrace a new future. We see the same pattern today. Cities that were once giants of industry, like Pittsburgh or Detroit, have faced their own collapse. The successful ones are those that, like the survivor cities of old, are reinventing themselves, transitioning from industrial economies to centers of technology, education, and healthcare. They remind us that the most valuable asset a city can have is not concrete and steel, but the ingenuity and adaptability of its people. The story of Rome's vanished cities is not just a tragedy about the end of an empire. It is a timeless, ongoing story about the very nature of civilization. It teaches us that our own urban world, for all its technological marvels, is not invincible. It is a complex system that requires care, investment, and the ability to adapt to change. But it also leaves us with a message of profound hope. It shows that even after the most catastrophic collapse, the human impulse to gather, to trade, to innovate, and to build communities is irrepressible. The city, in some form, always comes back. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through time. The story of our cities is a story of us, our greatest achievements, our most tragic failures, and our enduring capacity for renewal. It's a story that is still being written in every city and town around the world, and you are a part of it. If this story sparked your curiosity, please help it reach more people by liking this video. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey into the past. Until next time, look around your own city, listen to its stories, and remember the countless generations who built, lost, and rebuilt the urban world we have inherited.